Hello, and welcome to another episode of the ContinuousX podcast, where we try to solve for X in the SDLC equation. Today's format is a little bit different, that we're talking in a point-counterpoint style, and with our colleague Jason Quattlebaum, who's going to introduce a topic for Mike and I to discuss. And when Mike and I discuss things, it's usually we're in violent agreement, but it ends up being a pretty interesting discussion.
Rick, Mike, thanks for having me today. We're going to be talking about the separation of duties and how it can coexist within DevSecOps. Rick, to get us started with kicked off with today's festivities, can you give the definition around the separation of duties?
Sure. The separation of duties is more of a principle where you would need two or more people to construct in a process to reduce the amount of insider threat or fraud that could take place within a given process. For example, if you had you're cutting checks, the person who's preparing the checks should not be approving the checks. So it just kind of separates that temptation or the potential collusion of fraud that could be introduced into a process. Now, it's a little bit different from a technical perspective, but the concept still remains.
I think that's generally accurate. I'll agree to that definition.
Oh, okay, all right.
we're off an agreement. That's awesome.
So the second step or second part of that question is, can that coexist, the separate duties, in the DevSecOps cultural transformation, where the principle is really collusion with each other, working together. And some of the myths is the same person that could be developing an application can push it all the way into production with no other person really existing a push of a button using automation. Well, that in principle is true. You still can have the roles and responsibilities, permissions segregated such that each department or each group can still have their approval processes in place, their policies in place, so that it can still double check to make sure there's no insider threat.
I agree with that, but where that generally comes into play is this divisioning wall between development and operations, because operations would be the one that would, in theory, check against the fraud of development. And that's where I think it comes into conflict with DevSecOps, where DevSecOps is trying to break down those walls between those different groups, get them to work together. That doesn't mean necessarily they have to be the same team, but it does mean that they have to be colluding together, which is apparently bad.
Well, I think part of the DevSecOps transformation is the people aspect, the processes aspect, and the technology aspect. And while organizations can still have a DevSecOps culture, it can be manual. It's not the most optimum process. Automation is a key ingredient to it, but you could be on the lower scale of automation.
But automation's not going to stop you from doing separation of duties. Or not.
You didn't let me finish, but okay.
Okay, then we're in violent agreement.
So part of that is the automation has to take into account the activities and responsibilities of the relative groups that are participating in that cultural experience. Automation usually manifests itself in a more mature process in a pipeline from development all the way into production. But part of that pipeline are the individual groups inserting their particular technology and automation and policy checks to ensure that their responsibilities or their responsibilities are taken into account. So it can be automated, but most people look at separation duties as the particular people involved. But the people are represented by the manifestation of the automation and the roles included in that automation.
Yeah, but let's break that down to
Sure.
How that's done now. Is that, basically development can't see production. And operations are the ones who conceive and manually do things in production. Well, I think therein lies the problem, and that's the wall you need to break down to do DevSecOps and do automation. Yes, it's got to be in a pipeline. Yeah, and I have another point on that later. But the idea, though, that just by having two groups working independently is sufficient to stop fraud doesn't actually work in my mind, because one, I spent 6 months on a project and I compile it into a class and then hand it over and say, just launch this to an operations group. There's no stopping a fraud there. You don't know what I put in that compiled code. They're not breaking the compiled code apart. They're not asking for the source code. And then they're not breaking down the compile. They're just saying, oh, okay, the steps are to run this, and they run it. That doesn't help anything. I don't know how that separates duties
because now you have the security people saying it's very important for you to do scans against the dependencies of your class. Also doing static code analysis or static code security testing. So you're looking at the manifestation of what you've created in your class. So in theory, they are penetrating and having a role in that workflow.
Okay, so I mean, yes, I won't launch this into production until you've run these scans and you've run these things and you're showing me the results that they're good.
Right.
I mean, there's outright fraud of here's some fake scans that I ran, but if I were truly trying to scam someone, but let's put that aside. That's a rabbit hole.
Well, just it's not that the developers have to run the scans per se. The security people can say, as part of this workflow, I own this piece to run this, and I need the results of this. I can still see it whenever I want to. So it's like having a human being involved, but not manual, which will break the DevOps go fast and get these workloads into production fast, and DevSecOps being hold on there. We still need security checks along the way. All roles are represented, but they're represented in a technology fashion.
Well, as long as every group has access to the code, or rather maybe the pipeline, can understand what's going on in the pipeline, so that you can ensure that no one's pulling a fast one. And there's also that, hey, in development, peer review is very popular. I mean, that's everyone does a little peer review around the code of what that you've written, just more to see, hey, did you do it correctly or did you do it efficiently? But also, if you were trying to throw fraud in there, then you would. That's another layer of stopping of collusion. But I don't see the same thing on the operations side. No, I'm not an operations person per se, but until you get to things like GitOps and infrastructure as code, where you're storing those things and then no one's doing anything manually, everything's automated. That's, to me, the way to do separation of duties, because then no one has a place to hide. There's no one who can manually go in and commit fraud on the dev side or the operations side, because you got to be worried about both sides doing that.
Sure. And testing's an important key in there to make sure, the operation scalability, reliability, but they're also doing scans against the platform itself to make sure there's no ports open, that it could lead themselves to, attacks from either inside or outside. Even within your workloads themselves, they can run scans on the network communications. So to me, you have your one scale of everything's manual, and you have your security person going through and double checking to make sure you don't have any high threats or whatever your policy is, and just substituting that with their ability to ingest their appropriate technology to ensure that their role has been satisfied.
I agree with everything but the manual part, because then if you've got one person doing a manual job, even if it's the security, who's watching the watchman? Who's checking on them? If everything's automated and everything's running as code, then you can run scans on that. You can run peer reviews on that, regardless of its security, whether it's operations or development.
Well, I mean, and then it goes back to it is people oriented in this DevSecOps cultural transformation. They don't sit back like drones. They run the pipeline, but they're constantly looking for improvements. If someone's gaming the system, they're not off the hook of improvement, oversight, correction, insertion of other tools, which brings me to another point of yours, and I think it's a great one. With the technology, you have to choose the right technology that is most robust, that is supported, so that you're not overburdening your teams with constant, patches and checking to make sure that the latest version of Java doesn't have any, vulnerabilities. That should be offloaded into the larger either community or from an enterprise grade system. So everything is relative in terms of separation of duties, but it can be improved with the insertion of the right automated technology to represent the roles. Again, there's no perfect system. Even with two people checking each other, there's still human error potential.
Human error and collusion.
Try to remove it and make it more quantifiable or objective, as opposed to subject to bias or interpretation.
I think we're in violent agreement.
Wow.
Yes, terrible.
This type of format has hit a home run. Mike and I are usually yelling at each other and hanging up the phone in violent disagreement.
Thank you guys for keeping it civil today, leaving the boxing gloves at home.
Terrific. And for all your listeners, thank you for your time and attention. These are interesting topics that Mike and I are going to continue to explore as we search for the resolution of X in the SDLC equation.